So I think a lot of important comments there from Svetlana. And again, highlighting what we said on our last clinical call, our accountability now is the observational recruitment and getting these working groups rolling towards making publications. And that's what Samer will talk about. Samer and the translational teams have also talked about how the translational groups can support some of the publications that might be clinical papers, but with some translational secondary endpoints and proof of concept or mechanism of action type assays. So I know, Yanji, you needed to go. So before we go to Samer, we can go to you if you want, Yanji, depending on your timestamps, or else we can have Samer give an overview of what would you like to do, Yanji? How's your
It doesn't matter. I just would need to leave around 5:30. That's all. So we can start with Samer.
Okay, Samer, why don't you go ahead, and then we'll try to get Yanji out before the discussion time. So I think with the timestamps, that should work.
That sounds good. Can you hear me, Vijay?
Yeah.
Great. Well, we want to update everyone that in terms of the randomized trial, we have just finished a comprehensive review of all the SAEs in the randomized trial, all SAEs that had been reported. In the process, this is an essential step, as you know, for ensuring the validity and rigor of the data we collect. Without that, the analysis could suffer, our conclusions could suffer, the validity of our findings could suffer. So we invested a lot of time at the DCC in reviewing and adjudicating all the SAEs, over 200, and we discovered many other SAEs that we communicated with the sites about. Now, since the interim analysis had concluded, there had been numerous additional SAEs and numerous AKIs, numerous infections. Those are very important SAEs for the analysis of the trial, and they're directly related to the mortality, the primary endpoint. Now, we would appreciate every site's cooperation in this process because, talking about publications and scientific productivity of the network, cleaning up the SAEs, answering the queries we sent out for the SAEs is really important to help us get to the late breaking abstract deadline on September 15th. So please work with us, your teams, as much as you could to clean up the SAEs. We're going to be in constant communication with you over the next few weeks so that we have really optimal data set that has been vetted, verified, and confirmed. So that's our request of all sites and coordinators. The other big thing related to the data validity and rigor is pertinent also to publications because, before I jump into the observational stuff, I'll touch on the point that Vijay brought up about the translational things. As you know, we've held the special task force groups meetings for mortality and AKI. Already we had one meeting for each and one meeting for the observational. And then we essentially came up in terms of the relevant stuff to the translational group. For the AKI group, there were many other assays that were proposed to assess which part of the nephron was injured. This overlaps to some extent with what the translational group has suggested, but we will share our minutes from the AKI task group with the translational group so that we could coordinate our efforts. Obviously, we already identified the samples that we're gonna send to, that we're gonna connect with the UMass DCC to send to Yanji's lab to run the anakinra levels and anakinra trough levels and anakinra antibodies as we said we will do a priori. But these samples could also be used, since there is plenty of serum or plasma, could be concurrently used to run many other assays. For example, Yanji suggested running many other inflammatory cytokines in the same assay, which I thought was a brilliant idea to maximize the use of the samples. So we're coordinating with UMass and with Yanji's lab to ship her those samples. We've already picked them for the trough, and we've already picked them for the antibodies. Now, these time points, remember, were chosen in collaboration with the FDA. The FDA suggested specific time points. That's why we're choosing these specific samples. So that's that. That's the translational. We're going to share the minutes. I think we had a very productive AKI and mortality group meetings. We came up with many interesting suggestions. You will see them in writing. We'll share the minutes with the translational teams so that we could coordinate the studies, the translational studies we're going to do on the same samples to address the AKI aspect of the randomized trial. Now, the last thing I'm going to say is related to the publications. You know, our analyses, our data are as good as we enter them into the database. So if we don't enter the data, if we don't capture it and enter it in the database, we cannot run really solid analyses or come with, you know, solid results. So essentially, for the observational, we would also ask the sites and the coordinators to put concerted effort into entering the observational data. Like, for example, updating mortality data for the observational study so that any questions, and those have been coming, you know, steadily, especially with the observational task group that met today, many questions have been brought up. For us to be able to answer these questions, we need the data entered, you know, contemporaneously and completely so that we could answer these questions. I'll stop here and I'll hand it to Wanzhou to see if he has anything else to add.
I don't have much to add, but I would just want the group to know that we have structured our analytical team, basically embed individual analysts in each of the working groups. And our approach is basically goal-oriented. And when we identify the analytical items and we prioritize them, and then we basically work on each of these items depends on the data availability. So the data is the front end of the work. That's just as Summer said, it's really important. And then not only we want it to be accurate, but we want it to be made available in a timely fashion so that analysts can start looking at this. We have already started working on some of these problems when, you know, we feel the data sources are reasonably reliable. And for the working groups, and you will soon see our reports within each working group. Of course, these are not the final product because especially the observational study is still recruiting. So we will constantly update and share the results with each of the working groups. And we probably will also periodically update the clinical subcommittee and this group too.
Thanks, Wanzhou. Ramon, you have a question?
Yeah, very briefly, I couldn't attend the AKI meeting. I was not there, but I will share with you guys, we are finishing a manuscript within team of many biomarkers of AKI in ALHEB. We have a newer specific ones to differentiate tubulopathy ATM versus hepatorenal, that the overlap is a very complex issue. I don't have a clear answer because I was thrilled about to see more AKI in Anakinra. And Anakinra itself is not nephrotoxic. It's the opposite, is a nephroprotector in many, many models. So I don't understand. And this is absolutely unexpected. And I would like to share with you a little bit I think we have to do renin activity to see the volume, vasodilatation, etc. Because my mentors have the renal popes, etc. I have the renal amateur thing. I would like to share with you my data to the group, etc. to see where we can try to figure out if data AKI is more related to serious vasodilatation or is more a tubulopathy ATN. Although it's difficult to differentiate. Okay, this is something else.
Thanks, Ramon. Yeah, for sure. We need everyone's input for rather complicated data sets, but it looks like the work teams are off to a good start. And as you all said, they're goal oriented and will culminate in the publications that we want from the network now. Questions, comments? Yeah, Arun.
Yeah, I just one little cautionary note about measuring renin, having worked in hepatorenal for a long time. I can tell you that if the patient is not in a dark room in a completely quiet state, your renin data is really not any good. And I don't think these patients had samples collected under the conditions in which most people who work on the renin-angiotensin axis would consider the data.
Arun, just
We
so you know,
probably-
we can't hear you very well. We did hear your critique or cautions about renin-angiotensin.
Yeah, it's just, there's a larger pathophysiologic explanation for why that is. But I would think there are other markers of volume that we need to look at.
Mhm.
BMP, etc. and many others. Yeah.
So, yeah, go ahead.
We actually added, I believe I added plasma renin activity as a volume marker. Of course, we can also look at a BMP as well. These are fairly inexpensive assay that we can do. Now, we can also do renin concentration as well if that's what the labs are set up to do.
Well, why don't we transition to Yonji, since she'll talk a little about it, but I would say that probably our limiting step may not be money as much as it is volume of sample. And so thinking about wherever we might be able to immunoplex or do things at scale will probably, be best. But I know Yonji, you and and Bernd and the whole translational team are thinking about this, so we'll turn it to you.
Sorry, thank you. I realize that Bernd is here too, so Bernd, please, chime in anytime. I thought what I would do is that just to show you those points that were discussed with the translational group, and essentially a little bit following what Wan Zhu did at the very beginning for the RCT trial to kind of come up with aims that what are the things they can do to assess the results of the translational trial. I kind of tried to follow that and brought up a few points that the translational group thought we could deliver. And I'm going to try to share my slides here. Can you see all of this? Hopefully, right?
Yep.
So, and of course, everyone is going to be in there. So, as Samer pointed out earlier, one of the obvious things that we need to do, I think, in the RCT samples is to assess the circulating levels of the IL-1 receptor antagonist. That was, as he pointed out, planned to be done anyhow based on the request of the FDA. But then we can probably add on multiple other members of the IL-1 superfamily to provide us a much better picture of what's happening with the IL-1, both in the anakinra and in the steroid group. I think it's going to be very informative. I mean, theoretically, steroids should also inhibit the some of the formation of IL-1, but then of course that doesn't mean that necessarily that IL-1 is inhibited properly. So anyway, the whole, there's a whole bunch of various components of the IL-1 receptor family that we could measure in those same samples. So that was one of the proposals, and then the other aim was in order to seek better understanding of the role of inflammation in general and cytokines in the circulation, then we could, and we probably should measure various groups of cytokines. And again, it's like pretty trivial stuff to look at pro-inflammatory, anti-inflammatory cytokines and immunoregulatory cytokines and chemokines. And so within this spectrum, we can do these multiplex assays that from a relatively small amount of plasma or serum samples, we can measure all of this. I think in the NASH trial, we did a multiplex in which about 48 or so cytokines were measured, and those actually are pretty well-established methods that could be done. I think many of us talked about this before at the previous meeting, and it's kind of another trivial thing that we definitely should do is to look at longitudinal changes in the circulating markers of increased gut permeability. So this would be bacterial DNA, looking at circulating levels of LPS, flagellin, and serum lipoprotein binding protein. And I think if any of the other labs have other kind of favorite markers, then certainly that list could be expanded. But I think we all agreed that looking at gut permeability indicators is an important component. So the next one, continuing along these lines, was to potentially investigate circulating microRNAs. And this is something that, my lab, and I think some of the others might be interested too. And I know that Craig McLean's lab is looking at the cytokeratin levels. So I think that was already planned and proposed at the beginning. And one of the additional components are based on some preliminary data from our lab and others too, is to investigate circulating levels of macrophage and neutrophil activation. And we certainly know that the CD14, CD206 are good markers for infection for sure. And we also recently found the neutrophil extracellular traps, or these aspects that probably could give us some additional insights and novel kind of insights into correlates of clinical outcomes, particularly in this RCT study. So the other component of the circulating markers that I think we are all interested in and very relevant is the liver regeneration markers. And some of these that's been proposed, and actually it was in our original translational grant, is the Saanich hedgehog, HNF4, astaxanthin, lipocalin, and AFP. But again, this list can be expanded. Moving on, additional markers that we probably are interested in include changes in the PBMC populations, in the longitudinal PBMC samples between the two RCT arms, and that would include various subsets of monocyte macrophages, neutrophils, and B cells, NK cells, T cells, and I think some of people are interested in dendritic cell populations as well. That again could be kind of very good indirect correlates of some of the infectious complications and even the clinical outcomes. The other component that again is on the planning is to look at the metabolomic profile of PBMCs. And then the new one that is being proposed is to do a multi-omic analysis with the RNA and ATAC to get better insights into cell regulation, not only at the level of the cell composition in general, but also the regulatory component, particularly in the single cell ATAC sequencing. And then I think finally, this, as you mentioned before, obviously the translational group also suggested that we should look at circulating and urine markers of nephrotoxicity, including KIM-1, creatinine, urine albumin, and some others. And I know that Laura's lab already had this in their original proposal. I didn't talk about the microbiome component. That's something that certainly Bernd and Craig's in collaboration is actually planning to look into this, although I don't know if that was originally planned in the RCT trial. And I think that was the end of it. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides and happy to answer any questions.
Ramon?
Yeah, so thank you. A couple, I think that renal, I will send you some other ideas, and the HNF4 alpha transferrin is the best, and we have a paper in that.
Okay.
But the main comment is the following. So we have an array of biomarkers, probably more impossible. You'll see all the angles, but we miss out which phenotypes are we going to compare in order not to get crazy, because obviously is death and alive people that did a good outcome and about outcome regardless of the therapy. But then we should, in the anakinra, which patient responded or which patients did not respond, at least to have some phenotypes to try to do the first kind of biological clinical correlations. No, have you thought about the phenotypes that you want to choose, how and the rationale?
So absolutely, Ramon, but I think when we do these biological measurements, we want to be as much unbiased as we can. So, you don't want to run like, these are the samples that of the patients who died, and this is the one who did not.
No, I
Because
mean to do the analysis of the correlations. You do everybody, and I'm biased, and you do everything. But then
Right.
you need to answer research questions: is why the patients that improve, and when the patients that die. No, so basically, what is the difference? And you can have good and bad outcomes regardless of the therapy. But then in the anakinra, maybe we can have responders versus not, or to have different phenotypes to do the first analysis, the first pilot data. Otherwise, you will get lost about so many patients and so many biomarkers. It would be difficult to do the first studies. Okay, so I just think that defining some questions and defining the phenotypes to do the first set of analyses, it will be helpful to then later on to do more granularity studies, more detailed studies.
So there's a lot of questions. Yanji, I know you had to leave as well.
that's all right. I mean, obviously this is important. So
But yeah, and I think, we'll have to, I think what Yanji's put up is a straw man of the kinds of things to do. But Bruce, we're going to need your help to start to get line of sight of what was the principles for biospecimens, what was going for things that were proposed, and then now recognizing the opportunity that we have the clinical samples of patients treated. What are the assays that we want that will link to those papers? Because that's where this conversation started, is what links to the clinical papers. And then what might be new assays. And I think that's what Yanji and Ramon are debating about, how hypothesis driven that would be, or how discovery oriented. But which of those are actually just new lines of work that might be ancillary studies, I think we'll have to start to get line of sight on that. And probably, Bernd and Yanji, the work you're doing with the repository, you'll probably have to start to think about these kinds of issues so we can figure out. Also, we said you get scale by doing a multiplex in one place, but also, just from 5-6 hands up, you can see that a lot of people want to be involved and get involved in some of the studies. So we'll have to think through all of that as well. So Waj, then Laura, then Arun, then Dasarati.
I'll be very quick.
And yeah, you can, why don't you just make your comments and then Yanji can respond, because she does have another commitment, and then we also have other things on the agenda.
Sure, just very quick. If it's at all possible, when you run the IL-1 receptor antagonist assay to separate out detection of the drug from endogenous, I think that might be very useful.
So I don't know that technically I don't know that if that's possible actually.
Okay.
In fact, yeah, no, probably not. That's a good point though. Yeah.
And I just want to broaden out the biomarker analysis. So I think that some people put into their translational proposals to do, the biomarkers that they thought were interesting in the observational study, but not in the clinical trial. And I almost think we have to broaden it out to say that all the translational people should look at their biomarkers in response to the interventions, rather than just saying the few people who thought ahead to say, yeah, we're going to look in the clinical trial. Because, that was, 4 or 5 years ago, and now, new data is available.
So I think that's a good point. I mean, I don't know, and we have to figure out what are the new things or additional things that were not in the original proposals, or what we did, because otherwise it gets confusing, right? That and then maybe that's where Svetlana can help out. That if we were given a grant, or those of us who originally had RCT samples proposed for a grant to be tested, then why wouldn't we do that when it is not obsolete? In fact, we are just this conversation just proves that in fact looking at those longitudinal samples in the RCT trial is very important, because it may help us to better understand the outcomes. So I would say that absolutely we should expand this to everyone, but we have to see that what are the additional things that other people can do, right? That other labs are going to bring in. That's what you are saying too.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
Yeah, so that
absolutely.
there's more
Yeah.
than, the people who
Yeah.
put in originally is more like cytokine chemokine centric, but I think we could broaden it out to the
Yeah.
lipidemics and other.
Beyond that, right? Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like Arun and Dasarali had something.
Yeah, hey, Ranjit. So just two quick points. One, that a more comprehensive set of renal biomarkers to test different parts of the nephron are definitely needed beyond KIM1. And I can coordinate with through the
Yeah.
AKI group with the translational group around those. The second are
Absolutely.
bile acids. You know, when you are cholestatic,
Mhm.
you cannot get bile acids out the biliary tree, so you sulfate them and you get rid of them through the kidney. And in fact, it's well known that cholestasis sets people up for AKI. And it could be that there are some differences in the
Yeah.
lithocholic acid, which is very cytotoxic, which would give you an obvious explanation for any renal injury.
I think those are all very good points, and then I think it kind of covers what Laura was pointing out, that
about
you know we could do
so.
things that were not in the original plans.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Janji. I'm just going to be very brief and expand on what Laura had said, which is that, you know, when we started this study, we were expecting a very positive outcome. And even though we don't want to call it as anything else, but clearly Anakinra is not superior. So our analytical translational questions may have to be modified considering two components. One is we don't have the full set of samples that we planned for, because we didn't recruit that many patients in the RCT.
Yeah.
The second is, should we rephrase the translational questions to address as to what happened that really resulted in such a low infection rate? What happened that resulted in such a low predictive value? I shouldn't even say low predictive value, the opposite of what we expected with the Lille criteria. So these are questions. And you know, I agree with you that the translational people had proposed, but as Laura said, these were questions that were asked, you know, 5 years ago, and with expectation from the DASH results.
Yeah.
And you know, these grants, and I'm sure you're right. You know, Svetlana could probably provide some clarity, or maybe she can suggest what we should do. But these are grants which I think should to answer based on evolving observations, which is that we found something completely unexpected now.
Well, I totally agree with you, but I would still make the argument that, you know, if you really are interested in like, you know, the really low infections or response to steroids, as far as we know, the best indicators of response to steroids is some of the cytokine levels and some of the immune activation markers. So all of those things that were in this list, I think, are going to be incredibly informative.
But what I'm thinking is, why was Janji, the focus seems to be on figuring out what was the responder, etc. My question is, why didn't they get infected? What is, you know, this is the biggest question that has been in my mind since I'm looking at this data almost every day. I'm thinking, why did nobody get, you know, the infection rates were so low. We were discussing this repeatedly in our clinical, the outcomes group. This is the biggest, and this is going to be the one question that is going to be asked. And I think we discussed it. Svetlana had this great idea, whether it is because of COVID-related severe restrictions, but was there some characteristic that resulted in low infections? Maybe these people are becoming different, that they're not getting infected, or something is happening to their profiles. You know, if we say that cytokines are different, you're saying, look at inflammation. I'm thinking maybe we should be looking, why didn't they get infected?
So a lot going on. It's all good.
Great point.
Yeah. So Bern, can you help us here? What might be next steps? I mean, we're hearing a lot about, well, we had the core projects, and then now we have specimens from patients who have been treated. But again, I don't know how much we have, and Bruce will have some line of sight of that. But we probably want to get our arms around all of this before we start shipping things without strategy. So Bernd, can you help us? What do you suggest?
I think this is the most critical point, Vijay. We just need to see what samples are abundant and what samples we have not enough volume to do all of these assays. I think that's the most critical one. And I think what I can see is probably like serum and plasma might be the most demanded specimen in this case. The reason why, for example, we have not listed urine and stool is after hearing Dasarati, I think now I need to speed up and see if there is microbiome changes that actually prevent this infection. So I thought this, stool might not be as important to do in the first place. But so I think these samples can be, in my opinion, where we have abundant, not abundant in the sense, we have enough aliquots, but we can, these stool samples and urine samples, I think these can be sent out immediately and they can be analyzed immediately by the various investigators. Arun, we have Craig McLean's group is doing the bile acid analysis from the urine, and they actually have presented this in one of our translational committees. So I think this would be like another very good idea to have them do it. And then I think really the limiting factor seems to me that Gyanji, that we need to figure out, what plasma serum samples we have and how these can be divided up into the various investigators. And then I think we should make a plan on what has been mentioned before, what is more exploratory, right? So, metabolomics or something like this, that's great, but I think it will not help us in the near short-term future. I think in the short-term future, we need to, like what was brought up, we need to just cover this urinary markers in the urine. We need to cover like renal markers in the serum, like your inflammatory panels and the bacterial translocation. I think these are very short, low-hanging fruits that we can easily address in a very short period of time. These are standardized assays. We can do it in a very short turnaround time as well. I think that's how I see it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And then what we could do is and I would be more than happy to kind of have a priority order of all of this.
Yeah.
And bring this back to the translational group. And I think in the meantime, if Bruce and Donna could kind of give an inventory of the existing samples in the RCT, then that will help to sort this out. I think we kind of know that there is a possible shortage of the PBMC samples, but in terms of the serum and plasma, I think we might be okay to actually do all of these studies that at least the highest priority.
So is platelet poor plasma an option for some of this work? Because I would anticipate we would have a fair amount of that available.
Yeah, probably.
Okay.
And then the other point, I just want to make sure that we are collecting this, Arun, Ramon, and whoever chimed in on this urinary markers, that we can collect.
I have a list of that, and I'm happy to update this slide set in a way that we include those that Arun and Ramon and everyone else suggested, and maybe send it around or something. Yeah.
Because one question, because the samples are the main limiting factor. We should make like boxes by cytokines, PAMs, DAMs, biomarkers, to make sure that we don't use all this to respond one box and the other ones are underrepresented. So that is important. So we prioritize.
Yeah. Very
good. That those, Laura suggested maybe integrating a little bit the translational people into the clinical work streams. And I think the logic of that is that we can identify what would go into the papers as opposed to a small paper that might just be a descriptive cytokine analysis. We really want to integrate the translational studies with the clinical results. And that really starts to move towards that warehouse that one of the DCCs is moving towards. So I think that will be a high priority to try to use samples for things that can make those clinical papers even stronger.
Right.
Bruce, can you comment a little
That's
about
great.
what you're hearing and what you're thinking about in terms of this process? It looks like, you know, as Dasarathi said, we already have some committees that are looking at this. We need to integrate them into these new clinical manuscript committees. But what are you thinking about, Bruce?
I think, you know, we've already circulated multiple times the ongoing inventory of the RCT specimen. So we certainly have a handle on that. We can certainly work with investigators in terms of analysis for the translational side of the house. Wanzhou has the clinical side of the house. And, you know, we're looking forward to working on manuscripts. I think that's where the emphasis at this point has to be. I'll reach out to the working group chairs to, you know, to see how we can, you know, facilitate moving forward to sort of higher level analyses and, you know, I won't say meta-analyses, but, you know, the types of analyses that pull a number of experiments together so that we can get a better handle on how this will impact the underlying disease. So.
Dasarathi, you had some comments there, which are good points.
Welcome to.
Yeah.
And,
yeah,
and
anyway.
it might be worth to reevaluate all of our committees, because I think we don't necessarily want to keep all the committees and add a whole bunch of new committees. Otherwise, we've seen what that's like also. So I think we want to make sure that we're streamlined and smart as we do the committees. So if there's translational committees that want to integrate with the clinical papers, like if there's an AKI translational group and we have an AKI clinical group, that makes a lot of sense about how to integrate that. So I think there's something there to think about. Other comments, questions? A lot of active discussion. It was great discussion. Any other questions about these working groups? Yeah, these clinical working groups?
So I had a question to Svetlana. Svetlana, you know, I know that, you know, probably you'll be able to give an answer to this after maybe giving some thought to it. But would you think that the translational questions that were raised could be modified based on our current observation and the analyses that are really actively going on? Because I know that we are communicating with the DCC, I want to say practically every day, with questions, the answers to the questions and going back to records, and every site is probably doing it. So we're going to get lots more. So what is your thought of, you know, the questions that the translational groups had? Could we add more? Because these are really not contracts. These are really meant to answer questions, and they may really help us with our next renewal, because they may raise questions that really need to be addressed beyond just treating the alcohol use disorder. There might be questions that need to be answered for how do we treat the alcoholic hepatitis, because you know, frankly, we still, the clinical committee, this is what we were discussing, the outcomes people, as to what do we tell patients or the referring doctors now? Do we give steroids? Do we not give steroids? Do we treat with anakinra? You know, what do we do for them? So maybe adding some of these questions to the existing translational funded projects would not necessarily be, what should I say, you know, adding them on should be okay.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, very briefly. Yes. We can revise, you know, the original proposal, and not many group actually thought about analyzing this, you know, clinical trials. So mostly focus really on observational, because yeah, it's already like they wrote this 5 years ago. But I think we all agreed that the samples are really precious. From this, you know, clinical trial, and the priority is really, you know, design this translation so that they can help answer the main question, to understand this, you know, results from this, you know, clinical trial. So it's absolutely, but it's important important to really collect all the ideas, so they all should be on the table, and then really like prioritize, like Ramon suggested. So they should be really balanced, and definitely we will need, further discussion on this and decision, and it should be completely, transparent, and like everyone should be like really be active in making decisions. So no like rush in shipping the samples. I think it's a very, very important, and this needs to be like, discussed further.
And this is why I think, Bruce, if you remember this, we were prescient because when we made the RAC, this is the Resource Allocation Committee, we had both the clinical and the translational PIs on it so that there will be an integration. And this probably, we didn't anticipate this, but we probably thought that we would benefit from having both the clinical input as well as the translational input so that we decide where the prioritization of the samples would be, what time points, what temporal courses, etc. we can study. So thanks, Svetlana.
Okay, Ramon, and then we should move on. Arun also has a agenda item that we'll get to next that I'll introduce.
Very brief comment. I would like to improve our connectivity. So we have a folder in which each of the committees, instead of adding more, let's have all the, for example, what John just showed, etc. And we can do a little wiki, like in real time, we can give our input to others and be more connected, not only by emails that sometimes we're lost or by meetings that sometimes we cannot attend. That will improve in that phase now of a lot of exchange of information, input, and productivity. To be more connected with some means, it will help us a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Ramon. Okay, other questions, comments as we transition out of this? There was a lot to unpack there, so a lot of stuff going on, which is exciting. But this is our opportunity now, really to use this as the fulcrum, and now really to try to move all of the data we've collected into publications and to disseminate the information to help our patients going forward. So with that, Arun is going to give an update. As we said, it's really critical now that we make a lot of publications, good publications, important publications, and we execute. So he has completed the trial that he proposed. That was a smaller UO1 and has some of the data to share with us tonight.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Let me see how I can move this around.
We can't hear you now, Arun.
Okay, no, I was just, okay, can you see the screen?
Yeah, and now we can hear you. So maybe you were just testing us. Okay.
Okay, so this is a pilot study. Remember, we got funded to do 2 pilot studies. Our first pilot study, which is high-dose vitamin C for alcoholic hepatitis with sepsis. So we all know, I'm going to go through this very quickly because we're running short on time. As we know, there's no treatment for patients with ALCHEP and active infections. And this is a group that is at very high risk of mortality, and therefore the biggest unmet need for developing therapeutics for this space. We know that a lot of the action occurs in these people when they get multi-organ failure, and particularly involvement. So when you actually have ARDS type picture, you get these activated neutrophils which release, cause endothelial injury and flood the lungs. And so essentially there's release of a whole inflammatory response that leads to pulmonary edema. So vitamin C has been shown in very high doses to actually have an antioxidant effect, regulate NF-kappa B, improve water channel expression, and also increase alveolar fluid clearance. So there was a study published in 2019, around the time when we were getting renewed, that essentially this is a randomized controlled trial published in JAMA, which showed that in patients admitted to the ICU with sepsis and lung involvement, there was actually a survival benefit, as you can see, as the overall mortality probability is decreased. So our hypothesis was that high dose ascorbic acid may be beneficial because of its anti-inflammatory effects. It might actually benefit both alcoholic hepatitis and suspected infection or sepsis. So this was pilot study to determine if there was a signal worth pursuing in a properly powered study for clinical benefit. We couldn't really power the study because we had no idea what the response in ALCAP would be. So our key outcome measures were safety, decrease in MELD score, improvement in individual markers of disease severity, markers of inflammation, ICU days, hospitalization, mortality, obviously. So this was a randomized, double-blind, single-center, prospective, placebo-controlled study of high-dose vitamin C. It's 200 mg per kg per day for 4 days, given intravenously in 4 doses in patients with ALCAP and suspected or proven infection. We had it this way. We used the, the criteria from the sepsis 3 group mainly to get patients in because that's a high-risk category, and we can't really wait for cultures to start treating people who, if you think somebody has, an underlying infective process. And then, of course, patients would come in with either suspected infection with these classical criteria, suspected of infection, and then proven infections. And then exclusions were no consent, patients who already had AKI, AST, ALT greater than 300, or other causes of liver disease present. UMass was the DCC, and we had to obtain a FDA IND and had a separate DSMB set up that had to meet monthly to review this data. So these are the baseline characteristics of the population. And so Bruce gets all the credit for doing all these very rapid analyses since we just wrapped up this study. So disclaimer is that these are very early cuts of the data. We're still doing a lot of analyses. We're trying to figure this out. We enrolled a total of 10 patients in each arm, and they were fairly evenly balanced across the 2 groups. Of note, though, you can see that the vitamin C group's creatinine was 1.4 coming in, and the control groups was 2.5. So these were baseline creatinines that these patients had, and it was not clear whether this was worsening or not. Mortality, there was no real difference between the 2 groups, as you can see. Now, of the major outcomes, as you can see over here, for the MELD group, there was a MELD difference that was seen over time. And then if you look at the ICU days, there was also ICU-free days. There were greater ICU-free days within the first 30 days in the vitamin C group, and the hospital 3 days in the first 30 days.
You were very quick with the mortality. Can you go back? Because this is our most critical thing in life now. You found 40%, 30? Gosh.
Yes.
So this is the traditional mortality, not the new mortality that we see.
Correct. But these are people who came in with suspected or proven infection.
So they are sicker, and
sicker.
Of course, the MELD was in the 30s, sicker than in our trial. You're right.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
So then the question came when we didn't see this big difference in the MELD. We raised the question that maybe, there are people who have died along the way, and how do you account for that? So this is a longitudinal sort of assessment that Bruce did on the 2 arms, looking at longitudinal MELD scores, looking at all patients. And you can see with the vitamin C group, the MELD score goes down, slowly drifts back a little bit towards day 4. Remember, you had infusions for 4 days, and that's why was our first time point at day 4 to sort of look at what happened. And then if you look at the bilirubin, you can see again over here on the treatment arm, the bilirubin comes down. Interestingly, they started at different places, but then the bilirubin came down in the active arm, and there was a bit of a difference over here. Now, study was not powered for any of these, so it's very hard to be absolutely conclusive about any of these. So then, Bruce, please feel free to jump in if I misspeak.
Okay, sure will.
He ran this mixed effects model, which is basically a time versus intervention interaction. And over here, you start seeing a bit of a difference approaching significance for ICU-free days. And of course, we did not see a difference with some of the other markers statistically, but visually, it seemed, again, going back over here, that the bilirubin seemed to come down and the overall MELD score tended to separate in these two groups. So that's sort of, so what from this very early, look at the data, what we can say is clearly there was no signal for survival, but it did tend to decrease the MELD, and reduce hospitalization. If you didn't die in the first 2-3 days, then it tended to reduce hospitalization. And we are, of course, still got a lot of data pending. And this is just sort of our first cut of looking at this completed study. And so just want to share that with the group to see if anybody has additional ideas. If anybody wants to collaborate on specific aspects of this, then we would love to collaborate also on any specific aspects. So, and that was another reason why we wanted to share this early on without it being fully mature. So I'll stop here and take questions.
Thanks so much, Arun. It's great to see the study completed. That's really good and shows the execution capabilities. So it's really, really good for the network that you're able to complete this. So thank you. Questions? We have just a couple minutes.
The coordinator gets a big part of the credit rather than the investigators.
Yes, you're right. That's true. Yeah, that's right. We take the blame though. If it doesn't work, that's us, right? That's
why
our
you get
job.
paid the big bucks.
Yes, I agree. Okay, questions, comments, thoughts?
Just a quick question. Were vitamin C levels any lower in any of the groups?
They're cooking, we are measuring the vitamin C levels. So we should have them hopefully in another 10 days or so. One thing I noticed that the creatinine decreased, but then drifted back up. So we're trying to take a deeper look. So Bruce, we'll probably need to see whether there were cases in the active arm that developed AKI after high dose vitamin C was started, because it does known to produce crystalluria. So we did not really see much crystalluria because that was one of our stopping rules for FDA. And we did daily urines in these patients to look for crystalluria. But I would be interested to see if the creatinine drift back towards baseline was what was involved. So we're trying to take a deep look at how much albumin was given, etc., to see if we can figure out what happened with why the creatinine tended to drift back up.
Okay. I had a quick question. We're at about time, but just to understand the analysis that you did, Bruce, that time effect analysis, was that an a priori secondary endpoint, or was that a post hoc analysis?
That was, well, looking at the MELD score over time with a mixed effects model was a secondary analysis. Some of the other things were more exploratory, which is the nice way of saying ad hoc. And we're still going down that road for sure. Given the small sample size, we'll have to see, what really comes up. But I think the visualization of the changes over time made a lot more, you were able to see what was going on more than just a couple numbers at the, at day 4. So.
All right. Well, congratulations again. Great work to finish a trial in LCAP. We know that.
No, we finished this one. We are halfway through our second pilot study. So we're shooting to finish on time before we run out of funding with 2 completed trials.
Yep.
All right. Well, it's a very active time for us. So I'm really excited to see all the energy and engagement of everyone and a lot going on. So look forward to talk to everyone again at our next meeting.
Great.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.